Hello and good afternoon. My name is Kit Cavello. We're conducting a very special interview with Kristi Sanford. We've covered a lot of events here in the city of Chicago. We've always run into Kristi. She's with the People's Lobby, Reclaim Chicago, as well as a few other progressive groups here that are trying to really bring social change here in this city. So, Kristi, thank you so much for being a guest for Heartlands Media.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Kit.
I think it's very important for our audience to at least understand your background. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and how you got involved with both Reclaim Chicago and the People's Lobby, and what you specifically do for these organizations? Because not only do you volunteer, but you're one of the main coordinators for a lot of their events that they hold all across the city.
Yeah, so I'm actually on staff with the People's Lobby and Reclaim Chicago, and I've been doing community organizing in Chicago for about 20 years in some fashion, but I started out doing work around the issue of workers' rights, and specifically supporting low-wage and immigrant workers that were trying to get union contracts and basically deal with workplace issues, including harassment, injuries, wages, health insurance, all that kind of work. But I got involved in the People's Lobby and Reclaim Chicago because I wanted to be doing things that were directly affecting me in my life. And so the issues that we take on are really related to the lives of most people in Chicago. And so what we want to do is reclaim government so that it serves the interests of people like you and me, and not just the donor class or big corporations and wealthy people that mostly finance elections, right? But we also want to win issue areas, everything from wage increases and changes in the legal system so that it can be more just for all of us.
I think what a lot of people fail to realize, especially if they don't live in the city of Chicago, is just our long, sad history of corruption and inept leadership that has, for most of our history, has really let the people down here in the city. I mean, a lot of people are just struggling to make ends meet. Some people are working 2 or 3 jobs, and it's still not enough to pay the bills, to pay the rent, and to ensure that their families are taken care of. So I think, for the most part, when you're out there, organizing these events and trying to rally the communities, what has been the initial response, at least from our current city government and previous city governments, when you're asking, hey, will this aldermanic representative come out here? Is there any kind of word from the mayor's office? Is there any kind of statement? Will they stand in solidarity? What has been the city government response towards what you guys are trying to do?
Yeah, so one of the big issues that we worked on with our friends at Common Cause a year and a half or so ago was campaign finance reform, which I know is something that you care a lot about. And we call it fair elections. So we would like to see basically public financing for municipal elections, so that if people like you and I wanted to run for office, the donations of our friends who made small amount donations would actually be matched by public funds, so that we could raise money from people who live in our communities and not just depend on developers or people who run corporations or other very wealthy people for that support. And when we were asking Mayor Rahm Emanuel to support that initiative, he drug his feet. And that is no surprise, because you look at his list of donors and you look at basically the fact that he had $6 million raised before he decided to opt out of this year's campaign to fund his election. And most of that came from very wealthy people, and many of them not living in our communities, not even living in our city, let alone our state, right? And so that was a big issue for us, and that was constantly like butting heads against a wall there.
And now as we enter 2019, I think this is the first time in a long time, I've said this time and time again on our show and even interviewing other progressive candidates that are running for alderman, this is the first time in a long time in which we can have a new type of city government, and possibly more transparent city government. And I know that Reclaim Chicago is right now endorsing a lot of candidates. About a week ago, you guys had held a huge rally at City Hall. We were there to live stream it on our Facebook page, and you had 5 aldermanic candidates as well as the support of National Nurses United there. So can you at least tell us, when you're selecting these candidates, what are you looking for them specifically to do and represent? And then at the same time, when you're out there canvassing, what has been the initial response from the said communities that you guys are knocking on the doors for these candidates, whether they're Andre Vasquez, for example, or Carlos Rosa?
Yeah, so Reclaim Chicago, our partnership, the People's Lobby partnership with National Nurses United, did just endorse 5 candidates, and we'll be endorsing more again in late December or early January. But what we've been looking for in these candidates is a willingness to basically provide a different vision for our city and not just see themselves as service providers who make sure that the trash gets picked up and the rats get taken care of. And those things are important, but that they see themselves as legislators who are leading on a vision for our city and not just acting as a rubber stamp for the mayor, which is what we've seen for a very, very long time, not just under Rahm Emanuel, but under the former Dailies, right? And so all these 5 candidates are people that have a vision for a much more equitable Chicago that makes investments in our neighborhoods and people, and not just in the downtown and the things that the kind of donor class wants to see, but really in our schools and our infrastructure and mental health clinics and all of those kinds of things.
And speaking of our schools and our mental health clinics, sadly under Mayor Emanuel's administration during his 8 years, 54 Chicago public schools have been shut down, and at least half of the mental health facilities have been shut down as well in the city, and it's fundamentally devastated communities and families and livelihoods that are going to be felt for a very long time. So what has been at least Reclaim Chicago's and the People's Lobby's response towards this unfortunate crisis that has happened in the city, and is there ever a possibility to truly reverse what has been done to reopen these schools and to reopen these mental health facilities?
Well, to do that, we're going to need revenue, right? Like a lot of, even when we talk at the doors with people who say, you know, I want my potholes filled, or I want cleaner streets, or I want the rats to be abated, right? The root cause of not having those things done in a more timely fashion is that we don't have the money for it. And the reason we don't have the money for it is that government at all kinds of levels has basically allowed tax breaks for very rich people and corporations, and we have a flat tax in Illinois, right? So a lot of the problems at the city level, they can be solved with more revenue from the folks who can afford to pay, very wealthy people and corporations. But the problem is at city council, there are only so many things they could do. For instance, they could do a progressive real estate transfer tax. So if you sell a house over $1 million, say, or whatever the large amount is, something that I could never afford to buy, but that I would pay a higher transfer tax than someone who's selling $100,000 or $150,000 condo, right? And that money could be used to invest in a lot of things. But most of the money that we can get is at the state level, around a progressive income tax and a LaSalle Street tax. So it's even important for people who are running for aldermen to understand what's going on at the state level and use their bully pulpit, use their high public profile to say that this is what they need and to help organize their constituents to demand those things out of Springfield, because that money will also trickle down into Chicago, and then we can afford to do the things that we want to do.
So I actually want to backpedal to a previous question, which was the response when you knock on doors, especially when you're canvassing for your currently 5 endorsed candidates. By the way, who are these 5 endorsed candidates? And
good question.
And what has been the response from the community, like when you're canvassing for these said candidates? Like, what has been the initial response when you have your volunteers knocking on doors?
Yeah, I think so. The 5 candidates are Colin Bird, who's running in the 31st ward. Rosana Rodriguez, who's running in the 33rd. Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who's running in 35. Andre Vasquez, who's running in 40, and Maria Haddon, who's running in 49, which is my ward, mostly Rogers Park. So the response at the doors is, I mean, when we knock doors, we don't just say, knock, 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 I'm here to talk to you about candidate X. We're going to ask you, Kit, like, what's going well in this neighborhood, and what would you like to see changed? And we're actually going to ask you what you think is important and what you think your neighborhood needs, or what's going on in your life. And so Colin the other day was talking about canvassing, and he's hearing everything in the 31st ward from, you know, I can't afford my property taxes, and I'm worried about having to move, to I'm worried that my schools are going to close, to I experienced wage theft on the job, like I didn't get paid for work that I did, right? And so we're talking with folks not just about, again, rats and trash, but about like big picture issues that city council should have a vision for and should lead on, like figuring out how we recapture TIF money and invest it in the schools so that we can either reopen schools or better staff the schools that exist. But that is really a question that needs to be put to the people of Chicago about what they want and need. But those are the kinds of things we're hearing on the doors. We're definitely hearing about the like service issues that people have, but we're also hearing about all the things that are going on in their lives because we're actually like asking them.
And I think it's very important because I think for a long time in the city, this population here has really kind of been used to a city government that only works for the top 1%. And this city is known to be hyper-segregated. The justice system is corrupt. Most levels of the city government is corrupt. And I think people want to see open transparency. And 2019 can bring that transparency to the city. Yeah. So, and there's also another potential chance for us to have a brand new mayor as well. Right now there's, I think, 19 candidates that are running for the office.
It's hard to keep track.
And there's probably going to be more either entering or leaving. Who knows what's going to happen.
It'll be interesting to see who gets on the ballot.
Absolutely. But I think the question I want to ask you, since you have been volunteering a lot and organizing a lot of events with the People's Lobby and Reclaim Chicago, what is the political legacy of Mayor Rahm Emanuel? And how can we reverse some of his policies that he's implemented here? I know we have to have a new city government and a new mayor, but what is his political legacy?
I mean, I think in many ways he continued the legacy of Daley, which was to privatize things or make the city work for the wealthy and the folks who run corporations here. And so, you know, undoubtedly Mayor Daley left the city with a big financial mess, and any mayor that would have followed in his shoes would have faced some very tough choices. But there are always a couple ways that you can deal with that. You can fight for what you need in Springfield, and you can have an orientation towards what people need in our neighborhoods, or you can continue along to like satisfy the needs of the folks who are funding your campaigns. And that's by and large what he's done. This last budget included a small amount of money to increase mental health services at the clinics that he didn't close, and included some money for extra trash bins and tree trimming, etc., but just really tiny, small amounts compared to what people really want and need in our neighborhoods. And so I think that is his legacy, is to keep serving the folks who fund campaigns. And I think the thing that folks should watch for in this next election is where are the Rahm Emanuel donors going, right? And that will tell you who's going to continue that legacy. And so if you want to think about where to cast your vote, you know, I would actually follow the money and look at who's not raising money from those sources.
That's quite true. And I think there's also another issue that we have to look at as well, and I'm pretty sure People's Lobby and Reclaim Chicago has talked about this as well, and that's gentrification that's happening in this city. And of course, you know, we've covered stories in South Austin, Pilsen, and numerous other communities all across the city of Chicago where you have these large real estate developers moving in and basically displacing people. Most notably in Pilsen, 10,000 people have been displaced due to these large real estate developers moving in and gentrifying the area. And I think we all want to see infrastructure rebuilt. We want to see our communities get improved, but people still want to live in their said community in peace. So with your organizations that you help lead and organize, what has been your initial dealings with, or at least what has been your initial response to dealing with these large real estate developers coming into these working class communities?
Yeah, I think that's actually an issue that other organizations have led a lot on. I know, for instance, in Colin's campaign in the 31st Ward, this is front and center for him because people are, again, like worried about property taxes, and the way that property taxes have been so regressive under Joe Barrios has certainly hurt people in the 31st Ward. And also in Pilsen and many other places that you talked about. So I think it's interesting, and again, this is something we haven't directly done work on, but there's been a grassroots movement for rent control, and you've seen various organizations like DSA and Jane Addams Senior Caucus and other folks, like they've been canvassing in a bunch of neighborhoods and had it on the ballot, including in my ward, where it passed overwhelmingly as an advisory, non-binding measure. And so I think that's really something to watch to see if we can move legislation in Springfield to basically undo the ban on rent control, because that would be one possible solution. But the candidates we've endorsed are also campaigning on much higher levels of set-asides and new developments for affordable housing, or higher amounts of money that people have to throw in to opt out, the developers have to throw in to opt out, so there's actually a substantial amount of money to invest in affordable housing. So the primary way that that our organization has been supporting it is through candidates that get that this is an issue and want to see the city invest in affordable housing.
All right. Now let's actually talk about another event that you held, at least I believe it was 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
It was at the California courthouse, and it was regard for bail reform.
Yes.
You had people like Andre Vasquez who was there, as well as former Illinois Democratic primary challenger, former Senator Daniel Biss. He was there as well, standing in solidarity with the protesters actually being inside the building, sitting down at the risk of being arrested. Can you at least tell our viewers the whole story? Because we were there, and you can check out the whole story on our YouTube channel to see, and our Facebook page as well to get to see the video. But I think it's one thing to see it on video, but I think it's another thing to really see what happened, because this is just another follow-up to a story that was done earlier the year before in 2016.
Yeah. So a little background for folks. Money bonds are a huge problem in Cook County, and money bonds are basically unaffordable. And so when people are arrested and charged, they are given a money bond. And the idea of a money bond is that you will return to your court date. It's supposed to be an incentive that gets you to return to court for your day in court, basically. But what happens is the bonds are set so high that people can't afford to pay them. And then they just languish in the Cook County jail for days, weeks, or months prior to their trial. So we're talking about 2,500 people now that are in the Cook County jail just because they're too poor to pay several $100s or $1,000 in a money bond. And so it's really like throwing out the window the whole idea that people are presumed innocent until proven guilty. I guess that would be like a value that people could talk about or connect with on our in our legal system. And so right now, people are arrested for all kinds of things, and they are incarcerated before they even get their day in court. And many, many of those cases are dismissed, and it's like destroying people's lives, right? So you can imagine, like, if you don't show up to work one day or 2 days or 3 days or a week, you're going to lose your job, right? So number one thing is people are already struggling to make ends meet. They're going to lose their job. They might lose their housing because they can't make rent. They may lose custody of kids. Like, it really destroys people's lives. And so what we were doing was basically demanding through a series of protests, and this particular one, about a dozen clergy along with State Senator Daniel Biss and some other activists went inside to the courthouse, the entryway of the courthouse, and sat down and refused to move until Judge Timothy Evans, who runs the whole court system in Cook County, agreed to meet with us. And the premise is simple, like, just don't give people bonds they can't afford, or don't give people bonds at all, right? Let people go home and return to their day in court.
Now, was there any kind of follow-up to ask him, like, well, how come you haven't enforced your other judges to follow through with his previous ruling? Because otherwise you guys wouldn't have been doing the protest in the first place if said ruling was enforced by other judges. So what's going to happen now going forward? Because it seems quite clear that you guys have to deal with this and actually hold these judges accountable so that they don't just, again, turn a blind eye to promises that they made going back not only this year, but last year as well.
So there are a lot of organizations that have been working together to change this system, and the Coalition to End Money Bond is what it's called. So we have a lot of allies in this work, and we've been organizing for a number of years, and just over a year ago, I think the thing you're referring to is Chief Judge Evans actually made a significant reform to bond court. And he said, okay, judges that sit on bond court, at my discretion, you need to only assign affordable money bonds. And it worked for a little while, and the jail population went down by maybe 1,600 people, which is important, but it could be down another 2,500. And so he replaced the 6 judges at bond court with 6 new judges. And for a while, they mostly followed the order. And the reason we know that they started to lapse on following the order is because we actually sent people, the coalition trained and sent people in to watch both before the bond court was replaced with new judges and afterwards, and have since been tracking. And you can see the prison population steadily inching upward again. And so there are 2 judges in particular, Judge Clancy and Judge Like, that we want him to replace because they're 2 of the 6 are the most egregious about giving people money bonds they can't afford. So that was one of our demands. That was why we were there. And so we actually did end up getting a meeting with Judge Evans, and we sat down with him last Tuesday, and he did agree to one important thing, which is to put one of our coalition members on a statewide commission that is looking to reform bonds, because this isn't just a problem in Cook County, right? This is a problem around the state, right, although we feel it very acutely here. And so that was important for us to have a voice there, but my sense is there's going to be a lot more pushing that we're going to have to do, because we're still not anywhere close to seeing those 2,500 people free. Yeah,
and of course, there's a long set history of, prisons and, of course, people being sent to jail here in this country. The United States has the most prison population than any other developed world
we have the biggest
we have the biggest prison population in the developed world, and it's a real impact on what it can do on the livelihoods of families. So, when you're there, especially organizing these events, are people and relatives who have maybe family members in the California courthouse, are they there? And what have been some of their stories and just how they're trying to get by? Because I think a lot of people fail to see that there are actually real human lives being impacted by this, by these rulings. And of course, I think a lot of people, especially who are sitting comfortably at home, don't realize just what people have to do just to try and make ends meet when they got a loved one behind bars, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this is a real challenge. Like, for folks who have been incarcerated, they want to support the work, but a lot of times they're not going to be the ones who are going to go in and risk arrest, because that would be very difficult. Like, if they were to actually be arrested, it could trigger a whole avalanche of things for them. So I feel like a lot of what the clergy that were inside were doing, and the allies were standing up in solidarity with them, but putting their bodies on the line in a way that some of the folks that have been through this system cannot afford to do. But like specific stories, like one of our members, and this is not from Cook County, this is actually from when he was growing up in Florida, but you've heard a lot of folks talk about lately how with the closure of mental health clinics that our Cook County jail has become like the place where people who are struggling with mental illness end up, because they're not getting services, right?
And just to add on to that, that's not really an ideal location to have people who are dealing with mental illness. In fact, it causes more problems, especially in the long run, especially if they are released back out in the public. It's a clear danger.
Well, and so just to connect back to Tim's story, like when he was growing up, his mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia and, didn't get the treatment that she actually needed, and so was arrested and incarcerated for some time precisely because they couldn't afford to pay the money bond. And during that time, when he was young, his younger brother, they were, preteens and teenagers, they lost their home, right? And they were homeless for a bit. So that is actually the consequence of, like, people being locked up before trial or not getting the mental health care that they need and deserve, is people losing their homes, people, like, falling out of school, like dropping out of school, etc. And they're really like catastrophic things that are really hard to recover from. I can imagine if there was a period of time where I was homeless in my youth or wasn't going to school on a regular basis, what that would have meant for me and where I might be today. So those are real stories that we hear all the time, and it's like a real crisis and a real moral urgency to deal with this problem.
I'm also glad, as you mentioned, that there's a homeless crisis here, especially in the city, because the problem right now that we see in Chicago is that there's an increased rise in tent cities, like underneath bridges or either in dilapidated homes or anywhere here in Chicago, and it's a real problem. So when it comes down to really helping out people, especially who, for the most part, the reason why the biggest cause of homelessness is usually a medical bill or some sort of unfortunate disaster where they got a relative behind bars and like they lose everything.
Lose
like
a job.
One bad day and you could lose everything here, especially in the city of Chicago, where it's really expensive to own a home or have an apartment. When it comes down to really helping out the less fortunate, especially here in Chicago, what does Reclaim Chicago and the People's Lobby do to really ally with other groups to get people back on their feet and at least try and give them a chance to have a better life?
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations that are doing good social service work here in the city, and as an organization, we don't do any direct service work.
Right.
We do all work around policy, and some of it sounds like we have a People and Planet First budget at the state level that sounds pretty wonky, and it's all about taxing rich people and corporations, but then we have an idea of like where we'd spend that. And that money could go into services for homeless folks, or strengthening our education system, or making higher education that's public, like our public universities, free. So most of our work is around like reclaiming money from corporations and the 1% so that government can invest it in the communities that really need it.
Right.
Because every day, like, the opposite happens, right? Like, our tax system, where people who are poor and working in middle class are overtaxed to pay for, like, to pay for services that are increasingly inadequate because of the tax breaks that are going to corporations in the 1%. And so that's why we focus so much on that, because we think government actually ought to be the place where we collectively decide what communities need and like make investments in the communities that really need them.
Right.
And that might turn out to be more funding for, homeless services, or it might turn into all kinds of different things that communities need.
Right. And you also mentioned that you reached out into Springfield too, and one of the problems that we have here in Illinois is the flat tax. You mentioned it earlier in the state of Illinois. How do we really deal with that one issue? Because it's put into our Constitution, and of course now that we have a new governor, J.B. Pritzker, he has thrown around or even proposed the idea of a progressive income tax. Whether or not he follows through with that has yet to be seen. But how do we really address this one issue that's kind of holding back a lot of revenue for a lot of organizations and facilities that desperately need it? Because now we have this flat tax, a lot of people are losing much needed support and care.
Yeah, I mean, they raised taxes on all of us and then also made cuts at the same time, and that's not acceptable. And so we have to remember that J.B. Pritzker actually campaigned on this issue. It was central to who he presented himself to be. But there's no way that this is going to happen unless all of us demand that it happen, unless there's a coalition of unions, of community organizations like ours, of social service agencies, of everyone that could benefit from this. We need to constantly remind the governor-elect that this is what he campaigned on, that he has to deliver. Because if he doesn't, it'll set us up for more of the same, more cuts and more austerity, and then we'll end up again with another Bruce Rauner. And I actually think that's the reason we ended up with Bruce Rauner, is because the Democrats under Pat Quinn didn't actually deliver anything for working people, and in fact tried to cut their pensions, right? And so people were angry, and I think a lot of teachers stayed home that election, and a lot of folks, not just teachers, but people were angry about it, and they didn't see the Democrats doing anything for them. So if we go another 4 more years like that, I don't know how the state will recover. So it's really urgent that we hold Pritzker accountable to his pledge.
And real quick, for our viewers and subscribers, where can they find you guys online on social media for Reclaim Chicago and the People's Lobby?
So if you're interested in the 2019 elections, you can go to reclaimchicago.org, or you can follow us on Twitter at reclaimchicago, or at facebook.com/reclaimchicago. You'll see all of our events there and endorsed candidates. And after the new year is when we'll really kick into high gear, our door-to-door canvas and phone bank. So that is one place. And then for some of the other issue work, you can visit the peopleslobbyusa.org and at People's Lobby USA on Twitter.
All right, thank you so much, Kristi Sanford, for joining Hard Lens Media. We've covered a lot of events for you, and we've hoping to cover more future events as the years or the months keep on passing by. I want to thank our viewers for watching us. If you want to learn more about Hard Lens Media, check us out at hardlensmedia.com. Peace, everyone.
You're watching Hard Lens Media.